So I guess there's a couple of things to cover off today. Obviously, I've titled the talk Beyond API Wrappers. This is similar to a talk that I put together and I've run a couple of times around trying to move away from that concept as seeing MCP servers as simply a wrapper around API endpoints. And in today's talk, I'm going to add in some more kind of advanced features from the actual MCP spec, which we can use to basically make the servers a lot better. And I've got a bit of a demo at the end. I also realized that I'm now the last talk between you and getting out there to those ice-cold drinks, which are now getting lined up. So I had fortunately prepared this as more of a lightning talk. I realized I had more time for it, so it'll probably fall somewhere in between those two time points. A bit about me, I'm Tom Mclaughlin. I'm a member of the technical staff at tomoro.ai. We are a forward deployed engineering consultancy. We work with enterprises to build out solutions around LLMs and around MCP and basically around generative AI for the enterprise. And the big focus for us is getting things into production. So a bit about the sort of API wrapper problem, as I've called it. I guess there's a couple of things on this slide to sort of talk through, and also maybe one or two things to call out as well. These are kind of representative MCP servers. I'm not actually saying that these guys are bad, and actually most of these aren't even MCP servers. I'm basically calling directly to their APIs, but it's just an illustrative example of kind of what this might look like. So on the right-hand side, you'll see that we've got a whole bunch of tools, and this is typically what this architecture looks like. You've got basically your client on the left talking to a handful of servers, which then encapsulate like an actual bunch of downstream tools. The problem with this, the way I see it, and I'm sure the way a lot of you have encountered, is kind of threefold. So on the tool side, because you're basically blowing up the tool numbers by each server, you quite quickly start to hit your tool limits. If you move over to the actual LLM and client side, because you're essentially just loading a bunch of doc strings into context, you quite quickly get into sort of context confusion where you have a bunch of tools which sound sort of similar, and it then becomes difficult for the LLM to decide which one of these tools is actually the one to use. And then from an end user perspective, which is probably the most important part here, because you're essentially working with a really generic set of tools which are ultimately just API calls, it becomes very hard to conceptualize if I have a task in my head that I'm trying to complete, which one of these do I actually need, or which bunch of these do I actually need to achieve that intent. And part of my thoughts on why that is there's a little bit of an abstraction kind of mismatch there, because if we take the same sort of set of servers again on the left, you can see that each one of them will have an absolute, like a total bunch of tools underneath the hood. And for the particular workflow that we're interested in, we're probably going to want to use one or two from each server. So what you end up with is a whole load of redundancy of tools, and you probably found this if you're playing around with Claude Desktop and you've loaded a bunch of your favorite MCP servers in there, you end up with a bunch of tools which you've actually never used, and you have no idea when you would actually ever use them, but they are encapsulated in a server that you want to use, so they're there anyway. The sort of solution which I'm about to show and sort of like suggest is we focus more on outcomes the way that an actual end user would. So we're not thinking in terms of like API endpoints or tools anymore. We're just trying to say, what is the actual task that I'm trying to solve for, and what are the sort of steps that I would need to do in order to get there. And in order to do that, we basically take from that list of tools on the left only the ones that we really, really need, and then we build a very opinionated and very specific MCP server around those tools, perhaps with some resources and stuff thrown in as well to really tackle that use case, and then we expose only that to our client. So we've basically gone from multiple servers with multiple tools to one server with one or two tools and a couple of other resources or features from the spec that might make that better. So I guess to kind of bring that to life a little bit more, and I'm going to move into this more in the sort of demo section here. What is actually a workflow? And I've basically said a workflow is a full sequence from the input to the actual outcome of the task that you want to perform. And it's not so much focusing in on the actual individual tools along the way. So the ultimate workflow, which I'm going to show in a minute, is basically, I guess, a bit of background context. Right now, I'm working with a rather large mobile gaming client. And before working with them, I actually had no idea about sort of the mobile gaming space or how to actually build games. I was once upon a time a gamer back in the day. I played a lot of RuneScape, but beyond that, I had no idea like how to actually build games. So one sort of concept that came to me was like, how do you actually go from like a really quickly hand-drawn sketch, which maybe takes a game artist like 30 seconds to do on a piece of paper, to actually having that concept art live in an actual game environment? And I wanted to sort of tackle that workflow. On the left, you'll see like some of the actual tools that you might want to use to make that happen, and sort of a rough order which you might want to go through that on. And on the right-hand side is the actual workflow, which from an end user perspective is what I really care about. I want to take my sketch and I want to have a game character loaded into my actual game environment. So the sort of shift to make that happen from like a bunch of tools to what I just suggested is almost like a sort of change of location for where complexity lives. On this graph here, I've basically got on the left, what does this look like when we're talking about this as an API wrapper? And on the right, what does this look like when we're talking about it as a workflow? And the sort of top half is basically complexity living in LLM context. And the bottom half is basically it's in your actual MCP server runtime. So on the sort of API wrapper front, we can see that pretty much all of the complexity is lying on the LLM context front, because we've basically just got a whole bunch of tools with docstring, which tells you how to use it, all loaded into context at one time. But on the actual server runtime, it is like completely simple. Basically, all you're doing is just calling out to API endpoints and getting the response back. And obviously, there's more to it than that, but like essentially, you've front-loaded all of your complexity into the LLM context, which I would say is possibly not the best place for it to be right now. As model performance improves, that might change. But I think for where we're at right now, it seems like it might make more sense to do something different. That something different is kind of what I've been talking about here, where we shift to the half on the right, where we're building out these workflows. And essentially, we've reduced the complexity, which sits in LLM context, by basically having really opinionated, really specific tools, which allude to a complete workflow, and perhaps some resources or sort of other MCP features that you might need to complete that workflow. The complexity there moves sort of below that server line into your actual server runtime. So then you've basically got some steps which you would actually need to complete to make that happen. And this is essentially your workflow. Some of that might be getting data, processing that data. If you need sort of human in the loop there to actually elicit that from the user, you might use sampling to sort of make that process more efficient, so that you're not having to basically hard code that exact list of steps. You then might call another API, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and then you finally return the actual output back to your user, which should be the output that they care about. How do you actually find these workflows? They're not invented, they're very much discovered. At Tomorrow, we work on a majority like forward deployed engineering basis, where we will basically go to a client site. You will sit down with your domain experts. You might shadow what they do. You might just watch them work. You will basically look at the tools they use, the systems they use, how they use them, what are they actually trying to achieve for, and then basically we can start to construct solutions around that. I was chatting to Adam from FastMCP last week about this kind of concept, and he had this line which I actually really, really liked, and he basically said, if you look at someone who has 12 browser tabs open, that's ripe for an MCP workflow to be based around it, because essentially they're having to go to lots and lots of different discrete systems to do different things and essentially feed one thing into the other, and that's essentially your workflow. So we can start to build out around that. So going on from there, workflows, as we're suggesting here, basically mirror how people actually work. And whenever I actually work on things, I typically don't make every single decision up front. I like to make decisions at the right point through that workflow. And I like to kind of make them progressively. And one of the features from the MCP spec which allows us to do this is elicitation. It allows for essentially this sort of progressive disclosure of options and choices which we can actually start to work through. So elicitation came out in the latest version of the spec, and as I said, it basically allows for this progressive disclosure of information from the user, and I've sort of tagged it as it allows you to get the right context at the right time for the server. I think the other way of sort of thinking about it is it allows us essentially to keep the human in the loop in the process, and it does that quite effectively. And it also allows us to build these sort of really widely scoped workflow tools without having to pass every piece of information that workflow is going to need to complete up front as a sort of tool parameter. So a bit of an example of what that looks like kind of in this image here. Really simple one. I've basically taken the sketch, I've colored it, and I asked the user, do you actually want to preview this sketch to ensure you're happy with it before we continue with the next stage in the workflow? Just a really simple yes or no response, and what you can see is on the right, if you're using this in Cursor or whatever client you are using it in, you can basically select if you want to do that before we continue on the rest of the workflow. Out of interest, in the room, has anyone played very much with Elicitation in servers so far? Okay, a couple. Out of interest, what, and you can shout this out, what clients have you played with them in? Okay. Any more for any more? Nice. Okay, yeah. So that's kind of what I found with this. Unless you're going to want to build your own clients, the support is still not quite there. I'm going to show it essentially in Cursor today. I wouldn't normally use Cursor, but it's one way of showcasing this, and it does it quite well. And their support for a lot of these features is really quite good. The other concept, which I'm going to sort of tie in here, is sampling, and I've included this kind of quote from Andrew Karpathy up on the top right about leaning or embracing exponentials, and I think this is something which we kind of hear in multiple formats all over the place these days. I guess it's also kind of Rich Sutton's the better lesson. We don't want to try and do anything too clever from a tooling perspective, which in a few months' time when we see massive model performance, is just going to make that effort completely useless. So I think sampling is one sort of way of bringing that into our sort of workflows. I guess sampling, kind of at a high level, what it is it essentially allows our servers to use the LLMs which are connected to the client. So your server can basically say, I want you to run inference on this query and I want to get this response back because I want to use it for something. And as a result of doing that, it allows our servers to basically get better as model performance gets better if we build this in the right sort of way. And there's a bunch of use cases for this. A couple I've kind of listed here. If you're doing sort of unstructured to structured data because you need it for something in your workflow server, that's a good use for it. If you wanted to summarize something, also a good use for it. And the last one is branch selection, which we actually do in quite a lot of projects. If you're essentially trying to classify or decide which branch you want to go down from a sort of workflow perspective, and that decision would typically be made by a human on some sort of judgment, an LLM can actually be quite good as a mechanism for sort of doing that branch. And I guess a bit of an example of kind of how I am sort of using it in this workflow. I'm not actually going to be able to show it in Cursor because it's not supported, but essentially in the workflow you're about to see in a minute, I will essentially give the tool call a description of what the actual sketch is and a sort of, I guess the sketch is uncolored. It's just an outline drawing. I'm going to say I basically want this to be green. Obviously, if you took that at face value, all that you would get is basically the entire sketch painted green, but that doesn't really make any sense. So it would make sense to give the description or the actual image itself to a model and say, hey, what is this actually a picture of? And then say, my overall preference for color is green, but how would you actually paint this? What would the head be? What would the body be? Et cetera, et cetera. So a bit of a demo on this. So, this is Cursor connected to my MCP server, and essentially there's two main things that this server exposes. One of them is a resource, which is basically a sketch image, which hopefully I can pull up. All right, I will do it in here actually. Yeah, as I said, we've got one resource and we've got one tool, and the tool is essentially go from sketch to game ready sort of asset. I'm going to get it to expose the actual resource just now so that we can sort of pull it up. So show me or let's just say, what is the resource? So you can see it's basically found this sort of dragon sketch resource. It's going to do a couple of things here. It's basically going to it's actually going to use the sort of multimodal perspective which you can get out of these models, in this case Claude 4.5. It's going to analyze it and basically tell me what are we looking at here. Let's see, what are we looking at? All right, okay. So this was basically the input image, which I'd basically taken. I didn't draw this. I'm nowhere near that artistic. This is basically hanging on the sort of coffee shop wall in the client site, which I work on. And essentially the concept here was like, how quickly can we take this sketch and actually turn it into an asset, which we could load into the game, which is, I suppose, now what our server is actually doing. So as you can see, it's now analyzed that image. It's basically taken out some of the key details there. So it's basically a large bat-like wings spread out. It's got a round, stocky body. It's got spikes. It's got sharp teeth, et cetera, et cetera. So we now have an idea of what we're working with, and I can now say I want to turn that into a game character. And essentially now I'm hoping that it's going to start using our tool. So yeah, it's found the right tool and it's now going to start using it. So you can see it's basically given the sketch description, which the model had basically taken by analyzing it. And the first thing that we're going to come against is essentially this first elicitation. So obviously you saw the sketch there, it was not colored. The first thing we're going to do is actually add color to it. So there's a bunch of values that I can choose here, and these are obviously set through that elicitation. I'm going to default it to green and actually submit that. And the first thing that it's going to do in this workflow is essentially take that sketch. It was a photo from my iPhone, so it's basically going to load it onto a white background, and then it's going to color it. And now it's asked me, do I want to preview the colored sketch? Yes. So it's essentially gone from what it was to now it's, as I said, loaded on a white background, and it's colored it, and it starts to look more realistic. So then, as I said, I didn't really know anything about how to actually create game assets before this, but then I realized the sort of next thing that you would have to do if you wanted to do that is turn it into a 3D model, and in order to do that, you basically have to do a whole bunch of stuff. The first thing that we're going to have to do here is basically specify what is the poly count, and for anyone who's not familiar with sort of poly counts, is essentially like a 3D asset is made up of really small triangles or other shapes, and if you take a whole bunch of them and construct them in the right sort of way, you basically can create these full 3D models out of that. So I can basically choose here how many shapes do I want to use for this, and that basically reflects the level of detail. I'm going to go for medium, so that's 40,000 shapes. Now, essentially, it's going to call out to, we use this system called Scenario, which is essentially an image model aggregator, and they have a really good API. So I've wrapped certain endpoints from that in order to do this. So we now have our 3D model, and it's asked me, do I want to preview this? And of course, I do want to preview this. So if I open this, this is going to be a bit of a kind of subpar experience because I wanted it to load up in the sort of 3JS editor, which I put together. But essentially, we've gone from that sort of flat version of this to the sort of medium poly 3D asset here. And yeah, this is kind of cool, and it's mostly sort of a showcase of the actual image model's capabilities. But the sort of next thing that you need to do if you want to basically bring that into a game environment is turn that from just a 3D mesh, which is essentially what it is right now. The next thing you'd have to do is basically give it a sort of skeleton, which sort of dictates, like us as humans, it can move in these directions, or it basically has these ranges of motion. So that's essentially what we're going to do now. I'll proceed to actually rigging that out. So essentially now what we're using is another model to basically say, here's a 3D model. I would basically want you to start to position bone structure within that, which would say that it has these sort of bones and they can move in roughly this sort of range of motion. So I'm not sure if this will actually work because our server didn't seem to load last time. Yeah, okay, we're not getting that. But if I show you it on here, it's a bit annoying, I'm not going to be able to show you this. But if I were to open that in 3JS, which actually I can do. Let me just try and do this live. Okay, I've actually preloaded it. That's helpful. So essentially what it's done here is, hopefully you're able to see this, is it's basically taken, this zoom is too fast. It's taken the actual dragon. You can't see this window. Let me share. Can we see this? Okay, so essentially what it's taken here, and this is probably kind of faint, but it's taken our actual dragon object and it's placed that bone structure inside it. So as you can see, the actual wings have basically these green and sort of blue bars, which represent the actual bone structure which runs through them. You can see that it actually has like a spine running all the way down it from sort of head to tail. It's also managed to capture some of the sort of like bone structure around the legs and the feet. So yeah, it's basically turned it into a fully rigged mesh, which is kind of cool. So yeah, that essentially gives us that final kind of output. There's obviously more to this sort of process, which I've not showed here. The next stage would be basically to animate that and give it animation such that we can load it into a game environment and then actually use it, which is what we're kind of working on right now. So if I go back to the slide. That's kind of it. That was the demo. It fell a little bit apart with my editor there, but yeah, that's kind of the key things I wanted to cover off. Moving a bit to workflow servers and basically how you can use elicitation and sampling to build the feature set out around that and make them more useful. A little bit about tomorrow there. I won't bother reading out or giving you the sales pitch, but if you're interested in building MCP and building around LLMs or working with great partners like OpenAI and NVIDIA and Microsoft, we're hiring. Feel free to get me on LinkedIn or out there in a couple of minutes. Thank you very much.